In this way, the arrangements of the individual businessman become more easily adjustable and independent both of fluctuations that are beyond his control and of those fluctuations that often reluctantly forced him into bad forms of business practice. The forms that rhythm or lack of rhythm bestow upon the contents of existence finally lost their form as alternating stages of development and present themselves simultaneously. The two principles of life that one can characterize with the symbols rhythmic symmetrical and individualistic spontaneous are two profoundly different trends whose opposition is not, as in previous examples, always reconcilable through integration in the course of development, but rather ultimately characterizes the permanent character of individuals and groups. Not only is the systematic form of life, as I emphasized above, the technique of centralizing tendencies, whether of a despotic or a socialistic kind, but also it gains an independent charm. The inner harmony and external conciseness, the harmony of the parts and the calculability of their fate, confer an attraction upon all symmetrical systematic organizations, the effects of which exert a formative power that extends far beyond politics to countless public and private interests. Such organizations are supposed to give the individual contingencies of existence a unity and transparency that transposes them into a work of art. It is the same aesthetic attraction that is aroused by the machine. The absolute regularity and reliability of the movements, the complete removal of oppositions and frictions, the harmonious dovetailing of the smallest and largest parts, imparts to the machine, even at superficial glance, a distinctive beauty. It is this beauty that is repeated, to a greater extent, in the organization of the factory in which the socialist state is supposed to give the widest possible application. But this attraction, like all aesthetics, is based upon an ultimate direction and significance of life, upon an elemental quality of the soul. This aesthetic attraction or verification is manifested only in tangible material. We do not possess that elemental quality as we do its aesthetic, moral, social, intellectual, eudaimonistic manifestations in practical life, but rather we are that quality. These ultimate decisions of human nature cannot be put into words, but can only be sensed in those individual representations as their ultimate and guiding force. Therefore, it is impossible to argue about the relative attractions of opposing forms of life in the experience of which the aristocratic and individualistic tendencies, no matter which area of our interests is affected, confront one another. Historically, aristocracies prefer to steer clear of systematics, of the general form that places the individual in a structure that is external to him. Genuine aristocratic sentiment demands that every form of a political, social, objective or personal nature develops independently and thus proves its own value. The aristocratic liberalism of English life therefore finds the typical and, as it were, organic expression of its innermost motives in asymmetry, in freeing each individual case from the prejudices formed by similar cases. Macaulay, the enthusiastic liberal, specifically emphasizes this as the genuine strength of English constitutional life when he says, "We do not think of symmetry, but rather of expediency. We never remove an anomaly merely because it is an anomaly. We do not set up other norms than those which are required by the specific case under consideration." These are the rules which have guided the considerations of our 250 parliaments from King John to Queen Victoria. The ideal of symmetry and logical roundness, which relates the meaning of every single event to a central point, is here rejected in favor of the ideal that permits every element to develop independently according to its own circumstances and allows the whole to appear as an irregular and unbalanced phenomenon. It is obvious that this contrast profoundly affects personal styles of life. On the one hand, there is the systematization of life, with its different provinces organized harmoniously around a central point, with all interests carefully graded and each content of these interests permitted only to the extent that the system makes allowance for. These comprise specific regularly alternating activities, a fixed alternation between activity and rest, in short, a rhythm in both coordination and sequence that makes no allowance either for fluctuations in needs, energies and moods or for the chance of extraneous stimulations, situations and incidents. Instead, the form of existence that is established is completely secure because it excludes everything that does not accord with it or could not be successfully adjusted to its system. On the other hand, there is the formation of life from case to case, establishing the most favorable relationships between the inner demands of every moment and the corresponding exigencies of the external world, a continuous readiness for experiencing and acting combined with a constant respect for the autonomous life of things in order to do justice to their representations and requests as they arise. In this way, the calculability and secure equilibrium of life is indeed sacrificed, and so is the style of life in the narrower sense. Life is not controlled by ideas whose application always leads to systematization and strict rhythms, rather, it is formed out of individual elements regardless of the symmetry of the whole, which is experienced only as a constraint rather than as an attraction. The essence of symmetry lies in the fact that every element of a whole derives its position, its justification and its significance only in relation to other elements and to a common center. Conversely, if every element follows its own impulse and evolves autonomously and only for its own sake, the whole becomes necessarily asymmetrical and fortuitous. This conflict, in view of its aesthetic reflex, is the basic motif of all processes that are played out between a social whole of a political, religious, familial, economic, social, or any other kind and its individual members. The individual strives to be an organic totality, a unity with its own center from whence all the elements of his being and his action derive a coherent and consistent meaning. But if the superindividual whole is supposed to be independently coherent and to realize its own objective notion of itself with self-sufficient significance, then it cannot possibly tolerate any independence on the part of its members. Hence it is impossible to expect a tree growing out of different trees, but only out of cells, or a painting out of other paintings, but only out of strokes of the brush, not one of which on its own possesses any completeness, independent life, or aesthetic significance. The totality of the whole, although it gains practical reality only in certain actions of the individual and perhaps even only within the individual, stands in eternal conflict with the totality of the individual. The aesthetic expression of this struggle is particularly impressive because the charm of beauty is always embedded in a whole, no matter whether it has immediate distinctiveness, or a distinctiveness that is supplemented by fantasy as in the case of a fragment. The essential meaning of art lies in its being able to form an autonomous totality, a self-sufficient microcosm out of a fortuitous fragment of reality that is tied with 1,000 threads to this reality. The typical conflict between the individual and superindividual existence can be interpreted as the irreconcilable striving of both elements to attain an aesthetically satisfying expression. Money, however, seems to serve the expression of only one of these two contrasting forms. For money itself is completely formless, it does not contain within itself the slightest suggestion of a regular rising and falling of the contents of life, it offers itself at every moment with the same freshness and efficiency, by its far-reaching effects and by reducing things to one and the same standard value, that is by leveling out countless fluctuations, mutual alternations of distance and proximity, of oscillation and equilibrium, it levels out what would otherwise impose far-reaching changes upon the possibilities for the individual's activities and experiences. It is significant that we term money in circulation liquid money. Like a liquid, it lacks internal limits and accepts without resistance external limits that are offered by any solid surroundings. Thus, money is the most decisive and completely indifferent means for transposing the superindividual rhythm in the conditions of life into the harmony and stability that allow a freer, more individual and more objective confirmation of our personal energies and interests. Yet it is precisely this insubstantial nature of money that enables it to support the systematization and tempo of life wherever the level of development or personal trends press for it. While we have observed that there is a close correlation between liberal constitutions and the money economy, it is just as worthy of note that money provides an extremely efficient technique for despotism, as a means for incorporating the most remote places into its rule which, in a barter economy, always tend to separate and become autonomous. And whereas the individualistic society of England has developed and become a major power through the growth of its financial system, money is also the precursor of socialistic forms of society not only through the dialectical process of turning liberalism into its negation, but also quite directly because, as we have seen, specific monetary conditions present the blueprint or type of social form that socialism strives to establish.